Has science buried God? What an amazing topic for this evening. Do you know, one of the most famous scientists probably in history was, of course, the famous physicist Albert Einstein, not merely one of the most amazing physicists in history, arguably possessor of the most amazing haircut in scientific history. And he's legendary, not just in terms of the brilliance of his mind, but also the eccentricity of his character. There are lots of sort of stories, both real and apocryphal, about Einstein. My favorite one, which I think probably is apocryphal, but it's so good I kind of wish it were true, tells the story of how after he'd come up with his theory of relativity in the sort of 1930s, whenever it was, he was doing a big lecture tour across the United States of America, lecturing at university after university after university on his new theory of relativity. And after about the sort of 60th day on the road, I mean, he was getting bored of this. And in fact, it was the last day of the tour he was giving, and he'd given this lecture something like 200 times, and he got bored of it by now. So as they approached the final university where he was speaking, he had a driver, and he turned to his driver, and he bemoaned the fact he was bored of his talk, and his driver sympathized. And then Einstein said to his driver, he said, David, do you think, you've heard my talk 200 times, do you think you could do it as good as I do? And his chauffeur went, actually, sir, I probably could give your talk verbatim, because I have heard it many, many times. And Einstein said, look, wouldn't it be funny if when we get to the university, what about we change places? What about, you dress as me and I dress as you? This was before the days of the internet when you could Google what people look like. And let's see if we can fool them. Let's see whether you could genuinely pretend to be me and I can sit at the back and have a laugh. And the chauffeur thought this was a fine idea. So they arrived on the campus, went into the washrooms, did a quick change. The chauffeur put on Einstein's suit and tie. Einstein put on the chauffeur's uniform and cap, and they went onto the campus, and lo and behold, the ruse worked. The chauffeur was given the welcome that one would expect to be given to an eminent scientist, and Einstein shuffled along behind, the cap down over his ears so that nobody would notice that hair. And got to the evening of the lecture, and it went really, really well. Not merely did the chauffeur do Einstein's talk as well as Einstein, arguably he did it better. He sparkled a bit more, he threw a few jokes in, he had the crowd in the palm of his hand, and Einstein sat at the back and found this very entertaining, until it got to the Q&A at the end of the evening. And it turned out there was a professor of physics on this campus who hated Einstein. Hated the man and everything he stood for, thought he was utterly wrong, and he had spent weeks working up the hardest possible question he could come up with on physics and relativity and so forth. It had footnotes and footnotes upon footnotes, and when the Q&A time came, he was the first to the microphone, and he looked at the chauffeur and said, Dr. Einstein, I have a question. Actually, it's the wrong accent, it was Einstein's accent. Dr. Einstein, I have a question, and he gave this very convoluted question to the chauffeur. At which point the chauffeur just stares the man down and says, sir, that is the most ludicrously simple question I have heard in my entire career. In fact, it is so simple that my chauffeur sitting at the back could answer it. And I would love to invite him up here to do so. Probably apocryphal, but it's a darn good story nevertheless. And Einstein actually is a darn good place to begin this evening's talk for the next 20 minutes or so, because Einstein said some really interesting things about tonight's topic, about the whole question of science and faith. Einstein once remarked this. He said, science without religion is lame. Religion without science is blind. Interesting observation. Science without religion is lame. Religion without science is blind. And what I like about that statement, the kind of generosity there of seeing that it's not either or, but both and. However, I meet many people today who think that Einstein was wrong, and that actually science and religion are actually at war with each other and are in fact irreconcilable. Let me give you a flavor of just one such person who would argue this way. Another very famous physicist, in fact, the late Stephen Hawking died a couple of years ago. And Stephen believed not merely was there no place for religion, there was no place for theology, there was no place for philosophy, it was just science and science alone. And this quote from him gives you a flavor of that. He said, philosophy is dead. And if you read the whole article, he's including theology under that title. Philosophy is dead. Philosophy has not kept up with modern developments in science, particularly in physics. Scientists have become the bearers of the torch of discovery in our quest for knowledge. Well, I can partly understand why for Hawking and for others like you, maybe for some of you here this evening, for your guests this evening, and you may sympathize more with Hawking than with Einstein. I can understand why for some, science has been elevated almost to quasi-religious status in our culture. I mean, after all, science has charts and graphs and gadgets and statistics and technology. It's given us so much in amazing ways. No wonder that many people think it really is the only thing that we need. And in fact, this elevation of science to this status, I think, has fueled this belief that we hear in many parts of our culture today, this idea that we don't need God anymore. Science has buried God. It's done away with God even. I meet many people who tell me that they believe that it is science, not faith. It is science that will lead us to utopia. Well, talking of utopia, actually, it's interesting. That is something that human beings are always dreaming of. If you look back through the history of art and literature and movies and music, utopia is a big dream that humanity has always had. It's the theme of a number of stories and movies and so on and so forth. And that we're always dreaming of utopia doesn't surprise me. They're always looking to make a better world, to kind of fix the world that we're in. Because there are two basic questions that every human being has really to answer. Two basic questions that all of us, no matter what we believe, have to wrestle with are, what's gone wrong with the world and what's the solution? I've never yet met anybody who tells me they don't think anything is wrong with the world, and most people have very different views on how we fix those kind of problems. But we live in an age that tends to tell us the biggest problems our society faces can be solved with science and technology. It's science and technology that are going to bring us a better, more wonderful, cleaner, happier, healthier world. In fact, listen to the words of one very famous scientist telling us just how he thinks the future might look thanks to the advance of science. This particular scientist wrote, he said, "We will soon have everywhere smoke annihilators, dust absorbers, ozonizers, sterilizers of water and air and food and clothing, and accident preventers on streets, elevated roads, and in subways. It will be next to impossible to contract disease, germs, or to get hurt in the city. Humanity will become united. Wars will become impossible, and peace will reign supreme." Doesn't that sound an amazing description of utopia? It was written, incidentally, by Nikola Tesla in 1915, and it looks charmingly naive from the benefit of over 100 years of hindsight. Yet despite our tendency to get carried away, like Tesla got carried away then and people get carried away today when it comes to science and its potential, I have to say I do love science. I think science is a wonderful thing. My academic background lies in science. In fact, my PhD that I alluded to during that interview was partly in computer science, developing computer software to look at ancient manuscripts and try and figure out the differences and similarities between them. So computer science is a field I've lived with for years. I think science is one of the best things that human beings have ever invented. And interestingly, and this is sometimes missed actually in this whole discussion, is that science is also thoroughly Christian in its roots. As many historians of science have remarked, it is no accident that science, and by science I mean an organized, systematic discipline of study funded in part by the state, that science has only actually arisen once in human history. And it arose in medieval Christian Europe. And historians of science of all faiths who've studied that question to ask why will tell you that when you begin studying that period, it's no accident that that's when science began. The historian of science, James Hannam, whose book is on the screen there, James is at Cambridge University, and he sums up the origins of science quite well, actually, in that book, God's Philosophers. He says the starting point for all science in the Middle Ages was that science had been created by God, nature had been created by God. This made it a legitimate area of study, because through science, man could learn about its creator. Medieval scholars thought that nature followed the rules that God had ordained. And because God was consistent and was not capricious, those natural laws, they were constant and were worth scrutinizing. And therefore, the only way to find out which laws God had decided on was the use of experiment and experience and observation. So it's interesting that science begins very much in that kind of Christian context. But for all of its usefulness, and I've said, science is incredible in terms of what it's given to us, it is interesting that when it comes to questions around things like utopia, science can't tell us what a perfect world would be. In fact, science can't actually even tell us what a better world would look like. The problem for that is that the reason behind that is actually fairly simple. Terms like perfect world or better world describe destinations that we want to aim at. And science can't tell you what you should be aiming at. It can help you in a very narrow way, perhaps decide to get you there when you've decided where you're going, but it can't tell you where you should be going in the first place. By way of analogy, I am a very keen mountain climber. The reason I moved from Scotland to Swindon is because of the many great mountain ranges that could be found there in that part of Wiltshire. And I loved, one of the things I missed from Scotland, and one of my favourite mountains in Scotland was a little, not a little peak, about a 3,000-foot peak called Cheam, about an hour from where I live. And if you Google Cheam, if you can spell the Gaelic, it is an astonishingly beautiful-looking mountain. I've climbed it many times. And if I decide to climb Cheam, having a map and a compass, and being Scotland a raincoat, is also a really useful bits of kit. But those bits of kit, my map and my compass and my Gore-Tex jacket, they can help me get to my destination, but they can't choose the destination for me. Because which mountain should I climb today is not a scientific question. And that sort of slightly flippant illustration reminds us that for all of its power and for all of its brilliance, all of its wonder, we need to remember that there are only so many things that science can do. And in some incredibly important areas, it can do absolutely nothing at all. Let me give you another illustration of the way that science has limits. Consider this very famous picture on the PowerPoint screen behind me. That is, of course, the Mona Lisa, painted by Leonardo da Vinci. And suppose we wanted to answer a quite serious academic question, really. Why did Leonardo da Vinci paint Lisa del Giocondo with that enigmatic smile? I mean, have you ever wondered about her facial expression? It's a fairly strange expression she's wearing. Is she bored? Is she anxious? Is she constipated? What is going on there? Well, I suppose we could do all manner of scientific experiments. We could perhaps do a computer analysis of the picture and figure out what percentage of the picture is red, green, or blue, the pixels that make it up. Fairly easy bit of computer science. We could perhaps get hold of the painting and scrape some of the paint off the Mona Lisa and commit a major art crime in the process. But hey, this is science. We could scrape some of the paint off the picture, do a spectrographic analysis of the paint, and figure out the chemicals that Leonardo used to paint her. While we're committing one crime, we might as well do two. We could take some of the wood frame that she's painted on, take a little core sample of the wood, and using a scientific tool called dendrochronology, we could figure out exactly when the tree was cut down from which the wood panels were formed upon which that picture is painted. Wonderful bits of science, a bit illegal, but there we are. But none of those experiments would answer the question we set out to answer: why does she look like that? To answer that question, we don't need science. We need another discipline entirely. We need art history. And in fact, as the Nobel Prize-winning scientist and atheist, incidentally, Peter Medawar, famously put it in his book called The Limits of Science, Peter wrote, he said, that there is indeed a limit to science is made very likely by the existence of questions that science cannot answer, and that no conceivable advance of science would empower it to answer. I have in mind questions like, how did everything begin? What are we all here for? And what is the point of living? And to Peter's list of questions that science can't answer, I would add other ones that are incredibly important in our modern age. For example, what is the value of a human life? Do human beings have inherent value and dignity? Human rights that we take for granted in our modern society and our discussions about justice and so on, that is based on the assumption that human beings have value and dignity and autonomy and so on, but science can't give you that. Science cannot tell you the value of a life. It may be able to tell you how to extend one, or to save one, or to destroy one, but it can't tell you the value of one. And incidentally, that is because science is morally neutral. Science is morally neutral, and that's another thing we are tempted to forget when we have this tendency to deify science. Science can't really think about categories like good and evil, and that's seen actually very powerfully in a historical example. The gentleman on the screen behind me, Louis Frederick Pfizer, was one of the greatest chemists of the 20th century. Incredibly bright and incredibly smart scientist. He was instrumental in developing the first artificial synthesis of vitamin K, which is a vitamin that is vital for blood coagulation. And that discovery about how to synthesize that chemical has saved probably hundreds of thousands of lives. He's a hero. He's saved many, many lives because of that discovery. But Pfizer invented something else. He invented something else. In 1942, the US Army asked him to help them develop a weapon, a chemical weapon, that could burn tracts of jungle and eliminate troops. So Pfizer and his team at Harvard University invented napalm, a gel that sticks to human flesh as it burns. On the 9th of March, 1945, 1,700 tons of napalm were dropped upon Tokyo, burning 100,000 civilians to death. Now maybe, just maybe, you can justify that in the wider context of the Second World War. But then, of course, we get to Vietnam, and we watch how napalm was used there, and it gets a darn sight harder. Pfizer's story is a salutary reminder that science can harm as well as hurt. And it's also a salutary reminder that science doesn't shut down religious or moral questions. It doesn't bury God, rather it opens up religious and moral questions. The more powerful we become as humans through tools like science, the more danger we find ourselves in, quite frankly, and the bigger the questions become. Because human beings, if we are honest with ourselves this evening, we are a bit of a moral mess. And science is often part of the problem here, not part of the solution. Which reminds me of one final issue with science I want to talk about in my last 10 minutes, 5 or 10 minutes or so this evening. And that's the fact that in most cases, science is remarkably good, I think, at diagnosing addressing symptoms, but it's often remarkably useless at dealing with the causes, the root causes of most major problems, which I would argue often turn out to be spiritual ones. And let me illustrate that by way of perhaps one of the greatest challenges of our age, the environmental crisis that our planet is currently facing. Now, for sure, climate change is the one that is most commonly mentioned, but a lot of the noise and fuss around that issue, I think, distracts from other equally valid issues and other crises that we don't talk about nearly enough. Things like loss of biodiversity and growing extinction rates, deforestation, sea level rise, pollution, especially plastic in the oceans. You know, when I lived in Scotland, I was struck by, no matter how remote a beach in the Highlands or wherever in the far north of Scotland you went walking on, you would always find plastic. And you don't need to spray paint yourself green and be an eco-warrior to see we have a problem. So what's the solution to all these environmental problems that we're faced with? It's very easy to just go, well, okay, we need to reduce carbon, we need to ban plastic, we need to send Greta Thunberg on another world tour. But what if something more profound is needed? Gus Speth is arguably one of the world's leading environmentalists today. He's a climate scientist, he's an environmental lawyer. For some years, he was a senior advisor to the US government during the Barack Obama administration. Gus was the White House's chief advisor on climate issues. He is a brilliant scientist. He is someone who probably knows more about the environment than most people in the world, given his 30 or 40-year career. He has no religious faith, as far as I know. I think he would probably self-describe as an agnostic. He doesn't commit one way or the other. So given that background and that expertise, his diagnosis of the big picture when it comes to ecology is quite remarkable. In an interview, he said, "I used to think that the top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. I thought that 30 years of good science could address those problems. I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with those, we need a cultural and a spiritual transformation. And we scientists don't know how to do that." Fascinating observation from a man with no skin, as it were, in the God and science debate. Well, I would say, as a response to Gus, that I think Christians who have been involved, as I said, in science since the very beginning, have long realized that science is wonderful, but we need something more than just science and technology. After all, it was Jesus of Nazareth who remarked, "What good is it for a person to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? Or what can a person give in exchange for their soul?" In other words, I think Jesus was saying, sure, we can gain power over nature, we can manipulate atoms, we can pile up wealth, we can rip mountains apart, we can destroy ecosystems, we can find even faster ways to send digital memes around the world. But if in the process we lose our very self, our very identity, what have we gained? I said at the start, perhaps the two most important questions that anyone can think about are these. What's gone wrong with the world, and what's the solution? What if the solution, as Professor Spaeth suggests, what if the solution to the greatest challenges facing us needs more than just science? Because you see, the Bible would say that the heart of the human problem is the problem of the human heart. That we have the ability as humans to use science for great good as well as for great evil. Think of the story of Pfizer that I told you. See, the Bible would say that God created us to be like him, to be in relationship with him. However, the problem is, as human beings, what we often want to do is actually be God in God's place, seize power for ourselves, and we just end up damaging the world and ourselves and one another in the process. And the whole sordid story of human history tells that story powerfully. But what if that's not the end of the story? You see, the exciting news at the heart of the Christian faith is that all is not doom and gloom, but there is hope and there is a future. But it's not to be found through clever science or smart technology or finally solving the problem of artificial intelligence, wonderful as those things may be in of themselves, but it requires something else. Next year is going to be the 55th anniversary of arguably one of the greatest scientific projects ever undertaken, celebrating the moment when on 24th of July 1969, human beings first landed on the moon, the result of years of science and engineering. And when Neil Armstrong, the gentleman who first walked on the moon, when Armstrong first saw the Earth from space, he was deeply humbled. And he wrote these words. He said, "It suddenly struck me that tiny pea, pretty and blue, was the Earth. I put up my thumb and I shut one eye, and my thumb blotted out planet Earth. I didn't feel like a giant. I felt very, very small." See, if we live in a godless universe, we are very, very small, and quite frankly, we are cosmically insignificant. Yet the Bible says that tiny blue pea, covered with even smaller tiny people with the capacity to reach the stars and to crack the atom, but also people with the ability of destroying one another when we go wrong. Those people, says the Bible, are very precious in God's eyes. And that the God who created all of that stepped onto that tiny blue pea in the person of Jesus, so that we would have the chance not just of knowing the science, but knowing the designer, and of knowing what life should really be all about, knowing what the compass should be aimed at. You see, my friends, we need answers, not just to the question, how do we do stuff, or how does stuff work? We also need answers to those big questions of why we're here and what we are here for. Questions that science was never, ever intended to answer, but questions which Christianity, the worldview from which science sprang, might have something to say, especially those words of Jesus, of course, who said, "I have come that you might have life and have it to the full." See, one final thought for you in closing. If the ultimate reality behind all that there is and will be stands not the impersonal dancing of atoms or lifeless equations, but if behind the whole of reality stands a God of some kind, a God who is personal, do you know that does at least raise a number of possibilities, doesn't it? In particular, it goes a long way to explaining why we are personal creatures, creatures who can communicate and think and reason and care and love and laugh in a way that pebbles and pendulums and petunias can't. It might also suggest, by the way, if there's a God like that behind the universe, why it is as human beings we are so inexorably curious, why we are wired to pursue knowledge and truth, both in and beyond the sciences, why we are so restlessly inquisitive. And of course, it raises another possibility as well, doesn't it? If the God behind the universe is personal, then perhaps he has done what personal creatures do all the time, namely to communicate, in which case we need to ask the next question: is there more that we can discern about God than simply what we can figure out looking at his handiwork as we explore that through the sciences? Is it possible to learn about the artist himself, not just his works? You see, if you want to know what I am really like, you could buy and read my books, and my publisher will thank you immensely. You could wait until I'm away on vacation, then break into my home and rifle through my personal papers. You could stalk me on Facebook and see what type of photographs and updates I post. All of those might get you somewhere. They might help you figure out a few things. But there's a much better way if you want to get to know me, isn't there? You could talk to those people who know me already, or you might get to know me personally yourself. And that's the invitation unique to Christianity, the invitation that God makes to us in Jesus Christ. Not just to know that there is a creator, but to get to know that creator for ourselves. Thanks for listening.